Today we're going to conclude the series in Galatians with a look at Galatians chapter 6. And Galatians chapter 6, before I dig too much into it here, the first sort of half of it, the first 11 verses or 10 verses, is a conclusion or a completion of Paul's thought from last week. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time this morning, is going to be in those verses. And then Paul gives his final closing remarks, which he writes with his own hand. So Paul, like many biblical authors, used a scribe to dictate his letters to, and they would write his words down for him. That would make it neater, easier for others to read probably. But Paul actually ends a number of his letters with his own writing. He closes out a number of his letters, including this one. And this one we know very specifically that he wrote the end part and even wrote it in really big font to make a point. So we'll see that in a moment. The name of this series, as I conclude it this morning, the name of this series was One Gospel, that there's one way, one source of good news, one way in which we are saved, and that is through Christ, the one inheritance, or the one seed who gives us our one inheritance of salvation. That it's this one way, that the law is not the way to salvation, that the law does not save a person, but in fact, Paul says that the law puts you under a curse. And yet there is still a law, and there is one law. And there's one law that attaches itself or is part of the one gospel, comes out of the one gospel. It was first mentioned in last week's message. That law would be summed up in serve one another in love. And today we look again as Paul concludes his thoughts on what it means to live in the one gospel or live out of the one gospel. So let's just read Galatians chapter 6. Brothers and sisters, if someone is overtaken in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so that you also will not be tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this you will fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone considers himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Let each person examine his own work, and then he can take pride in himself alone and not compare himself with someone else. For each person will have to carry his own load. Let the one who is taught the word share all his good things with the teacher. Don't be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a person sows, he will also reap, because the one who sows to his flesh will reap destruction from the flesh, but the one who sows to the Spirit will reap eternal life from the Spirit. Let us not get tired of doing good, for we will reap at the proper time if we don't give up. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. Look at what large letters I use as I write to you in my own handwriting. Those who want to make a good impression in the flesh are the ones who would compel you to be circumcised, but only to avoid being persecuted for the cross of Christ. For even the circumcised don't keep the law themselves, and yet they want you to be circumcised in order to boast about your flesh. But as for me, I will never boast about anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. The world has been crucified to me through the cross, and I to the world. For both circumcision and uncircumcision mean nothing. What matters instead is a new creation. May peace come to all those who follow this standard, and mercy even to the Israel of God. From now on, let no one cause me trouble, because I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. Brothers and sisters, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit. Amen. So there's a lot to unpack here, but we're going to camp quite a bit in the first part of that chapter. Throughout the letter, Paul has argued against those who would promote the law and make it a burden on people. He calls the law a curse. He calls anyone who's under the law to be under a heavy weight that cannot be lifted. In this final chapter, Paul flips that whole argument, the whole way in which the law is approached by the Judaizers, on its head. He confronts their view and flips it around on them. He redirects their fervor. There is one law that saves, and it is the law of Christ. This law is to serve one another in love. And then he flips it on them. The law is not a burden that we place on another person that they are compelled to obey, but rather the law is to lift the burden, to lift one another's burdens, to carry the burden of your fellow, your brother, your sister. It's not to heap on them greater burden, greater obligation. It's actually to carry it with them. It's to lift, to lighten. If they wish so badly to fulfill the law, or for others to fulfill the law, then the role of the Judaizers is not to heap the law and compel people to participate in things like circumcision, but rather to come alongside and help carry the burden. Now, I understand things get a little bit confusing in this verse, or in this passage, between verse 3 and 5. And so I put a clarification in the sermon notes, but just in case you didn't get them, let's just clarify that really quick. Because first he says we're to carry one another's burdens, and then he says you need to examine your own work and take pride in yourself alone and not in light of someone else. And then each person will have to carry his own load. And so it looks like, okay, well, we're supposed to carry one another's burden, but we each have to carry our own load. What's Paul trying to say here? And I think what he's getting at, and I read a number of commentaries and they all kind of agree, so I think I'm not too far off here. I think that we understand the first word used here when it talks about burden is a different word than when he talks about load. There's two different words there. And the first word refers to a weight that crushes. It talks about being crushed, being carrying a weight that is overwhelming. And when someone is carrying a weight that is overwhelming, Paul says we're to help them carry it. We're supposed to come alongside and help lift the crushing weight. The first version of weight refers to being crushed, and the tone of this actually implies that we've all experienced a crushing weight at times. That this is not something unique to one person, but that we all experience crush. We all experience being overwhelmed. And so we are to come together as a community and lift the burden together, to carry the weight that would crush one person, but would not crush many if we lifted together. It's supposed to be community. It's enacted shalom. It's lived out community that lifts one another's burdens, that carries a heavy weight that one person can't carry. It makes me think of the time that the entire small group of youth went outside and lifted David's car. One teenager couldn't do it himself, but a team of them could. Or the time when I think it was Karen's car got stuck in the snow one evening when coming here for something at the church. And a group of us went out and we basically lifted the front end of her car up and out of the ditch so that she could drive away or drive into the parking lot. And we couldn't do it alone. Couldn't do it with one person. It required a team of us. And many of us experience overwhelming and crushing weight in our life, and most of us face it alone. I talked about loneliness a lot last week. Most people face it alone. But we are to be a community that lifts each other's burdens, that carries the heavy weight together. The second reference, though, to carrying is a carrying of a load. And this word here is more like a packed load, like a backpack, or like if you had a bunch of sticks bundled and then strapped onto your back for you to carry. So it's talking about the kind of load that you can carry and that you're responsible for. And I think the key here is the responsibility piece. In the end, we will be responsible before God for how we lived, right? Revelation chapter 20, it talks about books and a book. And so the final day of judgment in Revelation chapter 20, this is a little side note, but it's worth it. It's in my notes, so I'm not off book today. There's a book, and in the book is the Lamb's Book of Life, is the single book. And in that book, if your name is written in it, you will be accepted into heaven, right? You are saved. And so you're saved according to the Lamb, according to Christ. But there's also books opened. And it says every person is judged according to their works as recorded in the books. So you will stand before God and be held accountable for what you did with the life God gave you. what you did with the gospel you were given, what you did with the people that he put in front of you to be in relationship with. You will be held accountable. Now, your salvation is taken care of in the book of life, but you will still stand responsible with the load that you were given, and you will have to carry that load yourself. And so we're to examine ourselves, to know our work, to know what we are doing it, to be able to know that we can stand before God and say, this is what I've done with the life you've given me. To stand before God and be held accountable with what he entrusted to us. It's kind of like the parable of the talents. And so this is the two types here. The first is a burden that crushes and overwhelms. And that's heavy. And I think that can come from two kind of places. One, it comes from the verse before. It can come from those who have been overtaken in wrongdoing. And the wording there is very important. Overtaken by wrongdoing. This is referring to sin and decisions to sin. But some people can find themselves caught or trapped in a cycle of sinful behavior or temptation that they can't seem to break out of and become overwhelmed, be crushed by the constant weight of their shame, their guilt, or their temptations. And that can create a heavy burden. There's other heavy burdens that aren't directly related to someone's sin that I think also apply here. The burden just of life, right? Which we'll talk about that maybe more in a few moments. But our first place where our heavy burdens come from is from our sin. We become overwhelmed and we become overtaken by a cycle of sinful destruction. And for that reason, it says we need to approach with gentleness. Because no one is without sin. We've all sinned. And so when we approach someone who's been in sin or living in sin or struggling with an overwhelming, crushing weight of their sin, it's not the time to heap more upon them. It's not the time to heap the law, to add a burden, to beat them down or crush them, but rather we're to come underneath, lift their burden with them. We've all been there. I've sinned too. I've also felt that weight of shame and guilt, and I see you're being crushed by it right now. Can I step under and help? How can I walk with you? How can I pray with you? Do you need a hug? How can we support one another? But there's a danger as well, and I appreciate that Paul works this in. Like, this is like 5 verses that are just packed with information. So Paul then also works in this warning to be careful. Be careful because we don't want to also fall into the same temptation or be crushed by the same burden. We need to be careful. And the way that we're careful is actually this. It says, watch out for yourselves that you also won't be tempted. But then verse 3 is this key verse. It's a very important verse because it says, if anyone considers himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. So look out. Don't fall into a temptation of pride. Don't fall into a temptation that you got this handled and that you can figure it out for this person. You can solve all their problems. Watch out that as you try to lift another person's burdens, as you come alongside them, that you not think yourself beyond falling yourself. Again, the implication here is that no one is a something. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Think of Philippians 2. In Philippians 2, in verse, I think it starts in verse 3, Paul says to consider others as greater than yourself. That our mindset and our heart should be like that of Christ, humbling ourselves beneath other people. And I find that verse profound because here it says, if anyone considers himself something when he is nothing, right? Jesus is the one person to ever exist in history who is something, and yet he still considered himself as nothing. The great danger of pride for us is that we often think of ourselves as somethings, or we pursue becoming somethings. I want to be clear here that Paul is not creating a dichotomy of two types of people. He's not saying that there are some people who are important And then there's some people that really aren't. You're just nothing. He's actually suggesting that everyone is nothing in terms of righteousness, right? You are not on your own terms holy, pure, free of crushing weight of sin, right? Every one of us falls short of God's glory. And so when we think ourselves something great, something worthy, something amazing, we set ourselves up for deception. We set ourselves up for pride. We set ourselves up to be crushed under the same weight as those we think we can help. So we should look at ourselves rightly as those who are here to serve, just as Christ served in Philippians 2. Really, like if you don't have Philippians 2 as like a go-to verse in your Bible, I'd recommend just bookmarking that. Philippians 2, verses 3 to like 15. Amazing. And this again stands in stark contrast to the legalism of the Judaizers. They suggested that in order to be a something, you had to follow the law, follow it to the letter, which Paul actually says, right? He says they don't even follow their own law in verse 13, in chapter 6, verse 13, right? He says they don't even follow their whole law. They just want you to follow this one part of it so that they can boast about that. And they actually don't follow the whole law. They just preach the circumcision thing so they don't get persecuted, right? They're not even doing this because they care about you. They're not leading you falsely because they care about you. They're protecting themselves from persecution because there's Jewish people who are going to go out there and kill you. Paul's like, I was one of those, okay? And I would go around, I'd kill Christians, and there's other Jewish leaders and religious teachers who will come after you if you're a Christian. But if you're a Jew following Jewish law, you can bypass some of that persecution. And so he goes, they're really just teaching this circumcision thing in order to protect themselves, in order to hide from the persecution, in order to avoid it. They don't want to be persecuted for the cross of Christ. So they're like, oh, no, we're Jewish. We're practicing the law. We're circumcised, and we're telling others to do the same. They're just protecting themselves. They're just trying to live for themselves, make themselves something, and they're trying to make the law to be the means by which someone gains something. And Paul goes, no, that's not what this is about. In fact, if anyone considers themselves something when they're nothing, they deceive themselves. They've tricked themselves into their own lie, and they've set themselves up to be crushed under a heavy burden. If we lived according to that way, trying to find ourselves approved within the flesh to other people in the world, trying to follow a strict legalistic law of 600 and something, 35 laws or something like that, we would probably struggle and fail to uphold the one law, the law of Christ, which is to love one another in love, or to serve one another in love, which is most effectively done by carrying one another's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. It's about living for other. So ultimately, this is good news. It's good news for those with heavy burdens, for the sinner and the broken, for the hurting and the lost. It's good news for each of us. There is a kingdom whose law is to carry one another's burden. That's the law. A kingdom in which each person is responsible for their own lives, for themselves, for their work, for their actions. You will be held responsible, but you're not left to struggle in it alone. You're responsible for yourself. You're responsible when you stand before God. And yet, we are not alone in the journey. We are not alone on the struggle. Can you imagine the radical impact that would have in our community, in our world? Can you imagine a church that just served one another, that came along and carried one another's burdens? Why do we find that so hard? It is hard. And I think we get it right sometimes, but there's so many. There's probably a lot of you here right now who feel a heavy burden and a heavy weight and don't know what to do about it. You don't even know maybe how to ask for help. I don't. I struggle with asking for help. I told you guys that last week. It's hard to ask for help. It means being vulnerable. It means setting aside my pride and my ego. It means admitting that I need help. But it also means risking relationship that might let you down. Unfortunately, and I'm going to talk about something that I don't know if we talk about it too often in church, but we're going to talk about church hurt for a moment. Churches don't always get it right, and a lot of people carry a heavy burden. And where we are supposed to be the church that comes alongside and carries one another's burdens, historically, unfortunately, even recently, the church, I'm talking big global scale or maybe North American scale if you want, but Europe is included probably in this, has failed to address people well. We have failed as churches to carry one another's burdens well. And we do get it right sometimes, but we often struggle. We're so concerned with how our church might appear, or so concerned with what it might cost, or whether we might get taken advantage of, that we won't help. I was in a church once that didn't even have a benevolent fund because they felt that if they had any kind of benevolence in their church, people would just take advantage of them. They just did not see the role of the church to provide support to the hurting. And so people come into church scared to share their burden. Because what if they get rejected? They're scared to ask for help. Because what if the church will just take advantage of me or not be able to help me and I'll just be crushed anyways? What if there's a false hope? But Jesus set up the church to be a community of people who would do life together, who would carry one another's burdens, who would follow the one law, to serve one another in love, to carry one another's burdens. That's our law. The messiness of life gets in the way. As I wrote this, I thought about couples going through divorce and the church being an unsure place, not knowing how that fits anymore. Can we both still attend church? Or does the church get involved? How do we engage in that? Do we back off from the couple? When my parents went through their divorce, my church disappeared. I didn't hear from them. My parents didn't hear from them. Nobody heard from them for years. A bit of a side note, but I went back to my home church a couple months ago for their 50th anniversary, I believe it was, something like that. And so I went back and they asked me to share, so I did. And one of the things I shared was that during a very hard time in our family, when my parents were going through a divorce, the church wasn't there. And so I kind of called them out on it. And I had a number of people come up and say, we didn't even know. We had no idea what was going on. And we're sorry we weren't there. And there was a great time of restoration and repair that was done there. But they didn't even know, which was kind of surprising to me. But that's part of why I said at the start here, we're scared to talk about our burdens. We're scared to bring those into this place. And then that perpetuates a continued pain. As I wrote this, I thought of the family with a newborn baby, overwhelmed by the sudden and drastic change of life and the newly added expenses and pressures and responsibilities and the nonstop crying. I was talking with a new parent the other day, and I said, how's it going? They went, oh, it's pretty good. Do you have any hints on how to help a baby stop crying? And I was like, throw them in a car seat, go for a drive. They're like, oh, okay. Apparently that worked. So it works for some, doesn't work for others. It worked for Olivia, didn't work for Lucy, When you were crying a lot, you should be listening. I threw you in the car seat and I'd take you for a drive around the block. Olivia would pass right out. Lucy would think it was fun. She'd not fall asleep. So the driving thing didn't work for Lucy. But anyways, but it's overwhelming, right? It's an overwhelming stage of life. It's a sudden change. And you prepare for it for like 9 months, but it doesn't really prepare you. Suddenly you've got this life that you're responsible for, and it's overwhelming. And how many of us feel safe to turn to the church and say, help? So much of our culture says, well, if you have a kid, it's all your problem, right? Maybe your parents will be helpful. Nice thing about this community is I see actually a lot of families coming alongside that way, which is really good. Kathleen and I didn't have that a whole lot. We were living anywhere near our families. And so we had to deal with that a lot ourselves. And I know many others who are like that as well. And it's overwhelming and it's scary. And where do we turn? And will the church even care? Isn't church just Sunday morning and get a sermon thrown at us for an hour by some youth pastor who thinks he has something to say? I can't turn there for help. What would they even do? But we're supposed to. We're supposed to turn to one another here for help. And we're supposed to be ready to bear one another's burdens, to come alongside, to get in and carry that crushing weight. I thought of the young person addicted to pornography, ashamed of his online behavior, but feeling completely alone in the struggle, not knowing where he can turn, who can support him. And he can't share that in the church because he'd be rejected. He'd be outcast. He'd be told he's not worthy of being in this presence because these are all somethings and he's now a nothing. And yet 95% of men in the church deal with pornography. He's not alone. This should be a place where we can carry one another's burdens, where we support one another, where we form teams to fight against these kind of temptations and cycles. I thought of the alcoholic, desperate to experience a meaningful life, but drowning in a sea of depression and isolation and uncertainty about the value and purpose of their direction in life. But they hide it. They don't want to show it. I get it. It's shameful. It's embarrassing. And who would understand? Certainly not this community. These are all good, upright Christians. They don't get it. But we do. Because we're all dealing with stuff. We've all got sin. We're all crushed under a weight of sin and shame. Or have been maybe at some point. And we're supposed to come together and follow one law to carry one another's burden. I thought of the teenage girl who so desperately desires love and has given up her virginity and now feels that she can never restore her innocence as she spirals into a cycle of shame that leaves a trail of broken relationships in her wake. Is she safe to come here? Would we carry her burden? These are all people that I've interacted with over the last 9 years here at Brightview. They're people in our community. They're people who aren't here at the church, some of them. Some of them are in our community, but they would never feel safe to come in here. They don't feel that their burden would be carried here, that they'd be safe to share it here. Not because they know Brightview, just because it's a church. We've all got stories of when life gets messy. But where do we turn when that happens? Where do we turn when life gets messy? Most people turn inward. Most people turn inward. As Christians, we're called to turn into the church. We're to turn towards one another. We're to ask for help. And we're supposed to be able to find that help because other Christians are supposed to be able to say, yeah, I'll come with you on this journey. I'll walk with you on this. This does not cause me to love you less. In fact, I will come alongside and love you as much as I am able. I was challenged several years ago, actually. I was confronted with the idea of, was there anything, any sin that would cause me to stop caring about a person? And I was confronted with a person who had decided to have an abortion, and they didn't want to tell me because they thought I would reject them. They were certain I would reject them, in fact. But when I finally found out, I went to the person, I first wrestled within myself. Is this something that would cause me to change my opinion of this person? But I went to them and I said, you need to know that there's nothing you can do that would cause me to love you less. There's nothing. Jesus died for my sin, and my sin is great. And yet he still loved me despite everything I have done and will still do in my life. How could I reject someone if Jesus wouldn't? Can we love people even in the midst of their sin and come alongside with gentleness to restore them, to lift the weight off their shoulders for a moment, bring healing and restoration? We've all had messy stories and messy times. We've all had hurt, and I myself have been hurt many times by churches, right? As I already said, my home church was largely absent during my parents' divorce. I've had my confidentiality broken in a church where I shared some personal stuff with a pastor, and he shared it. I've been judged, mistreated, and forced to leave a church. And many of you have had similar experiences of feeling abandoned, feeling ignored, feeling unseen. I've even talked to people who felt forced out. Others have felt judged with more weight thrown on them in the midst of their burden. Can't you see what I'm carrying? Why are you throwing more on me right now? We don't always get it right. But I wonder how much pride is part of this. The pride of the church to think that we do, that we're superior, that we've got this. And if you're struggling, that's because you're failing. That's a dangerous thing to start thinking. But I think sometimes we get into that. It's a danger, the result of pride, both in the church, and I want to admit, though, as well, that there's also a pride in the self, right? In the midst of the suffering I've experienced in the church, I had a part to play in that, and I did have my own pride, and many struggle with that, which is why I started at the beginning saying it's hard for us to come to the church and say, I have this heavy burden. Why? Well, because our own pride gets in the way of our vulnerability, of our confession, of our need for help. That's why verse 3 is such a key verse. Not as a way to beat yourself up, I'm nothing, but to go, you know what? It's actually not important that I be a something. If I need help, I should ask for help. If I see someone who needs help, I should help them. Because it's not about the appearance of how I look, but it's about serving others as Christ served. The intent of the church is to be a place in which we together can care for one another. In this, we make an incredible impact on the world around us. Like an amazing impact on the world around us. Look at verse 10 for a moment. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for those who belong to the household of faith. As I read that, my mind jumped right to John 13, just like all of yours did. But it went straight to John 13, which I can't quote from memory, so I'm going to flip to it really quick. In verse 35, Jesus has this line, and it's always kind of bounced around in my head. I'll start at verse 34, though, for context. I give you a new command. Love one another, just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. So the context is actually very similar, I'd say almost identical to Galatians 5:6, right? 5 and 6. And then verse 35, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. This is how the world knows us. This is how the world is to see us. If we get caught up worrying about our external appearance, and so we start trying to act extra pious or extra good, like we're something, we put on a bigger show, a bigger performance, make a more beautiful building, start dressing more prominently and standing more like this because we want to make Jesus look good. Jesus told us how it is that we're supposed to make him look good. Paul tells us how it is we're supposed to make God look good. It's actually in serving one another. It's not in some outward physical appearance or something shallow. It's something deep and meaningful. When a person is being crushed under the weight of shame or guilt or just the world, we're supposed to get in underneath of that and lift together. And the world will see how we love one another right here in this place, and it will change the world around us. They will know of our God. And it makes him look really good. But that's difficult. because it requires such incredible vulnerability and trust. The church is supposed to stand out. At youth group this past week, I did my annual Wow Weird message, talking about being a people that stand out, being weird in our world, but not doing it in the wrong way, to be weird in a way that like people are like, oh, they're weird. But the kind of weird that people are like, that's so different, but there's something so real going on there. There's something that we so need happening there. There's something so unique. And why is that? When they ask and we say, because our God told us to do it this way, because our God is with us, because this is the one law of our kingdom, is to serve one another with love. People are blown away. It's radical. It's life-changing. It changes everything. So we seek and work for the good of everybody, not just within these four walls, but how we love one another here makes a difference everywhere we go. So it starts here. To love one another right here, to carry one another's burdens right here. If you call yourself a member of Brightview Church or part of our covenant community or whatever it is you want to say, then your primary call is to follow this one law of serving each other, of holding each other up, of bearing one another's burdens. That's what makes us a community. That's what makes us a church and not just a club. Not just something that, happens at a community hall, but it happens here because we come together to carry each other's burdens. It's why Chris and I find fairly frequently talk about not just coming here to receive, but coming here to participate. That when we come to worship, worship is an act of giving to God. And so church is not just a place in which you come and get, it's a place where you come and participate in carrying one another's burdens. It's a place where we do this together. But it's hard. And it does require someone to go first. The good news is Jesus has already gone first. We can do this. We can be a community that cares for one another. We can be a community that carries one another's burdens. And the impact that has on our community outside of this church would be amazing, be radical. People would know our God. They will know Jesus by our love for one another. We can do this in love for each other because we recognize that no one is without sin. We can do this in love for one another because we can recognize that maybe you're a few steps ahead on your journey and you can look back and say, I've been there. I've carried that weight. I could do it again with that person. And you step back with someone else and you help lift that burden. We can do it because none of us are so much better than anybody else that we are too good to bear their burden. I just jumped to the Good Samaritan parable, right? Where the priests and the Levites, they walk on the other side of the road because they're kind of too good to deal with a man dying on the side of the road. But not so with us. We're to treat them like our neighbor. We're to love them and serve them. Now, none of us are perfect and none of us get it all right all the time and none of us have got it all figured out. But I'd encourage you to start asking the question of, how can I bear another person's burden? How can I walk with others in this community, in this church? What do I need to submit to? What do I have to set aside? What pride is getting in the way of serving others? There's only one law we need to follow. What's stopping us? Because if we could do it, it would make the church incredibly weird in our world today. And that would make Jesus look really, really good. Let me pray for you. Lord God, we thank you that you came first, that you loved us so much that while we were still sinners, you died for us, that you would bear the weight, the crushing, overwhelming weight of sin as you hung on the cross. Lord, let us not be like Judaizers who try to avoid the persecution of the cross, for it was on the cross that you bore our sin and our weight. And so God, I pray that you would help us to have that great humility, to be like Christ, to view others as better than ourselves, to humble ourselves, and then to come alongside and bear one another's burdens. Lord, help us to be a church that is weird because of the way that we love. Lord, help us to make your name great in the way that we love one another. We pray this in your name.